Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Paul Gavrilik, and I teach here in the theology department. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today our distinguished speaker, Professor John Greco. This lecture series, entitled Interdisciplinary Conversations, is an effort in cooperation between the theology department and the philosophy departments, and also the School of Divinity and the Center for Catholic Studies. And so the whole initiative, including the seminar on the faculty seminar on spiritual perception, is also funded ultimately by the Templeton Foundation through the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. Professor John Greco received his bachelor's from Georgetown University in 1983, and then came to pursue his doctorate at Brown University in 1989. After that, he taught at Fordham University from 1989 to 2006. And presently, he holds the Leonard and Elizabeth Eslick Chair in Philosophy at St. Louis University, at which he taught since 2006 for about 10 years. Professor Greco is the author and editor of 10 books, and I'm told more than 100 articles and essays that appeared in various journals and collections. The books that he authored include Achieving Knowledge, and the subtitle is A Virtue Theoretic Account of Epistemic Normativity. This is with Cambridge in 2010. And then the book that we discussed today, or parts of which we discussed today, was the book that he also published with Cambridge in the year 2000, and that is Putting Skeptics in Their Place, The Nature of Skeptical Argument and Their Role in Philosophical Inquiry. As we were wrestling with a number of philosophical problems today, Professor Greco mentioned to me that he is also a national champion in judo, which prize he won this year. So, of course, during Q&A, my suggestion is that we ask questions in an especially polite manner, because I certainly would not want to wrestle him on anything, including theology. He also is a national judo coach, because several of his students, including 2 of his children, have also been national champions in judo. Today's lecture, I should say, quite apart from that particular skill, he has also served on the Executive Council of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and that was twice. And he also presently serves on that organization's executive committee. He has also been the president of Philosophers in Jesuit Education, and also on the executive committee of the Society of Christian Philosophers, as well as held various posts in the American Philosophical Association. Today's lecture is entitled Seeing Good, Seeing God, on the Possibility of Moral and Religious Perception. Please welcome Professor Greco.
Okay, so mic's working? Yeah, okay, great. So thanks so much for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. I've come to St. Thomas a few times, and it's really a great intellectual community to be a part of and to engage. So I'm happy to be back. I want to clarify one thing about the judo championship. All that means is that I beat up a bunch of old guys, because they don't let me fight the kids anymore, right? I have to fight old men now. And so all that means is I beat up a bunch of old men, which is better than the alternative, which is that you get beat up by a bunch of old men. And so it's kind of a no-win situation when you think about it. But, so anyway, today I want to talk about seeing good, seeing God, the epistemology of moral and religious experience. It could have been called the psychology and the epistemology of moral and religious experience, but I'm not a psychologist, and I don't want to pretend that I have psychological expertise. But I do draw on some pretty basic stuff in psychology and cognitive science on the way here. So the first thing I want to talk about is the scope of perception. And what that means is it's a question about what kind of things can you actually perceive. Where I want to take perception in a literal sense, not in a metaphorical or analogical sense, but what kind of things can you perceive in the literal sense of perception? And some philosophers think that it's quite narrow and restricted, and much narrower than common sense would have us believe. So some philosophers think that we don't really see physical objects, say tables and chairs, apples and oranges. All we really see is shapes and colors, shades and contrasts, and then they'd say similar things about other modes of sensory perception, so that you don't hear children playing in the yard, you just hear sounds and things like that. Others think that we really do see and otherwise perceive physical objects, for example, apples on tables, sunshine on one's face, garlic on the stove, you can smell that. And in this, these philosophers think that all seeing is seeing as, so that when you see something, you see it as a chair or a table or as an apple. And that's different from seeing merely colors or shapes and then sort of inferring that there's an apple on the table or something like that, okay? So there's a narrower, there's a group that thinks it's very narrow. There's another group that thinks of it in a more common sense way. The narrow way, that's kind of old school. People don't really think that way anymore. Now I think there's a general consensus, not just among philosophers, but more importantly among perception scientists, that it's better to think of us as perceiving actual physical objects and things in the world as opposed to just experiences. But we also talk about seeing that some action is right or that some person is good. So does that mean that there's something like moral perception as well as physical object perception? Likewise, we sometimes say that we can feel God's presence or feel God's love. The Jesuits, I teach at a Jesuit institution, they have this idea of seeing God in all things. So does this mean that there can be religious perception or a kind of perception of God? So that's not a crazy idea, that there's a kind of moral perception. So for example, when you see an infant, you might see that cute little baby as precious. Likewise, you can kind of see the way she's looking at that baby. She's seeing something there of moral value, right? It's not crazy to talk that way and think that you're saying something literally. You're literally sort of seeing a moral value there. And similarly, you might take yourself to have a religious experience, maybe by seeing some particularly beautiful or awesome part of nature. You might get a sense that you're seeing God's creation and attribute a kind of religious significance to what you're perceiving. I took that picture myself, by the way, with an iPhone, no less. So, if you don't see it there, maybe you see it in Ireland. In this art, the baby Jesus has a little halo. Can you see the halo? So there's this representation of Mary, and I think it's John the Baptist, sort of perceiving divinity in the baby Jesus. But isn't that just metaphorical when we're talking like that? That is, we can't literally see that some action is wrong or that some person is good. We can't literally feel God's love or presence. Isn't that just a way of talking? And I suppose on what you might think of the standard view of perception, that's right. This is not, this is just sort of loose talk when we talk about perceiving here. So on the standard view, perception gives cognitive access to a very restricted, relatively narrow range of reality. So it might be just colors and shapes, shades and contrasts, tones and pitches. But even if you take the broader view, it's usually just physical reality and only certain parts of physical reality, basically, mid-sized dry goods. We also think of perception as giving us our most immediate and direct access to the world. And so if we can know moral or divine reality at all, it's not with that sort of immediacy or directness, which is to say that these God moral properties can't be objects of perception. You have to get at those things more indirectly, if at all. But although that's the standard view, I think that recent developments in the theory of knowledge, particularly the philosophy of perception and also the psychology of perception, give us resources to reject this standard view. So basically that's what this talk is about. I'm going to try to make the case that we really should think about the possibility of moral perception and religious perception as being real possibilities. Okay? Now, one qualification here. I'm using the word perception as a success term, what philosophers call a success term, meaning that if you can't perceive there's a sheep in the field unless there really is a sheep in the field. So I'm not talking about apparent perception or alleged perception. I'm talking about real perception here. So if you're a moral anti-realist and you think there are no moral properties, then you shouldn't think we can perceive moral properties. If you don't believe in God, you shouldn't think we can perceive that God exists. So the idea is, if there's a moral reality, if there's a divine reality, is it possible that we have perceptual access to those realities? Okay? So here's the outline of the talk. In part one, I'm going to talk about knowledge in general and some recent themes in the theory of knowledge, and especially, well, not especially perceptual knowledge, but some themes in the theory of knowledge. Then part two, I'll go into perception and perceptual knowledge in general. And how we think about that just for, run-of-the-mill physical object perception. And then in part three, I'll take sort of what we take from part one and part two and apply that to the possibility of moral and religious perception. I'll end by looking at some objections, why maybe this is not a good idea, and we'll see about whether we have resources to answer those objections. Okay, so part one, knowledge in general. So epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, is traditionally concerned with three major questions. What is knowledge? Why is knowledge valuable? And then what can we know? So that's sort of the nature, value, and scope of knowledge. So these questions, these sort of central questions of the field, lead to other questions, such as why is knowledge a good thing to have? And what makes knowledge superior to mere opinion? And in fact, why is knowledge superior even to true opinion? So we think it's better to know something than to just get it right by a guess. Or maybe you really want something to be true until you sort of talk yourself into believing it, and it is true, okay? Even though your opinion is true, it's better to know it. So why is that? What is it about knowledge? And that's very closely related to the question, what is epistemic excellence? What does epistemic excellence amount to that makes knowledge superior to mere opinion, even mere true opinion? So here's two, until recently, dominant views in epistemology. The one view you might call evidentialism. And roughly, evidentialism is the idea that epistemic excellence is entirely a matter of how well one's beliefs fit one's evidence. So the idea is if you want to know someone's epistemic position, if you want to know how good a belief is epistemically speaking, it's all about the evidence. You just got to know what is the evidence and then how does that belief fit the evidence. And then another view goes by the name internalism, and that's roughly the idea that epistemic excellence is entirely a matter of how things look from the inside. So if you want to judge a person's epistemic position, or if you want to judge your own epistemic position towards some belief, really all you have to do is kind of look from the subjective perspective and see whether that subjective perspective fits the belief in question. And then you could have a kind of internalist evidentialism which combines these two views. So the idea is that it's all about fitting the evidence, but the evidence is all about what's inside. And this is going to exhaust what epistemic excellence comes down to. Okay? Now, a major problem with these views is that they lead to skepticism about almost everything. Okay? We'll talk about this a little bit more, but one reason that these, let's say, evidentialism, let's say one reason internalism leads to skepticism is because what you've got going on inside the head just isn't enough to get you out to all the knowledge you want about the world. So if your epistemic project, maybe some of you saw this in Descartes, if your epistemic project is to start from what is subjectively certain to you from the inside and then build out to the external world that way using only those resources, you're going to land in a pretty much a universal skepticism. And that's the history of philosophy in a nutshell, right? And so that's why people have sort of gotten away from that internalistic way of looking at things, okay? Second major problem is that these views are psychologically unrealistic, and by unrealistic I mean naive. They don't really sort of mesh with the current cognitive science. So, for example, evidentialism tries to think of all knowledge on the model of good reasoning. Evidence is like premises that you have in your reasoning, and then for your belief to fit the evidence is for your belief to follow from the evidence via some sound or valid inference, right? So the philosophical tradition has taken that as the model that's supposed to be a one-model-fits-all kind of model that's going to explain epistemic excellence in general. But the current thinking in cognitive science is that reasoning is only one sort of tool in our toolbox, in our cognitive toolbox. Reasoning is one thing we do, but it's not the only thing we do. Perception is not reasoning, memory is not reasoning, introspection is not reasoning, proprioception, which is sort of a sense of your own bodily position, that's not reasoning. So basically, current cognitive science says that there are various kinds of modules, and if you think of them as information processing modules, they can be defined by the type of input that they take and the kind of output they deliver, but also the kind of cognitive processing that goes on from input to output. And if you think of it that way, then reasoning turns out to be just one kind of cognitive processing. It takes you from premises to conclusions via a kind of sensitivity to inference rules. But perception just doesn't work that way. Memory doesn't work that way, etc. Okay? So these two dominant views, until recently dominant views, they're not doing so well right now. So we need a third view. And the kind of view that I've defended and that other people have defended more recently is what I call a virtue theoretic approach to epistemic evaluation, where epistemic excellence is to be understood in terms of cognitive powers, or put differently, reliable competences or reliable abilities. And then you think of knowledge as true belief grounded in such cognitive competences or abilities. And knowledge is true belief grounded in competent agency or excellent intellectual agency, where agency is the sort of manifestation of these powers or competences. Okay. Now, on this view, not all cognitive powers are reasoning powers. So this sort of accommodates the current state of empirical psychology or cognitive science, which says, look, we've got a variety of competences or powers. Some of them are reasoning powers, but others are not. And so what matters is that basically your cognition in general is functioning properly, is functioning how it ought to, and also that it's appropriately meshes with the world that you're trying to know, right? So our perception, for example, of other persons, the sort of social cognition involved in recognizing faces and sort of understanding the mood a person is in, for example, or what they're trying to do, for example. Our social cognition is sort of, designed to be very well fitted with the social world, and that's another sort of cognitive module that we have, which is not best thought of as reasoning. We sort of perceive the social world in a more immediate way. Okay. So one advantage of the view is that it makes epistemic normativity or epistemic evaluation a specific instance of something much more general. So, for example, we think of athletic abilities or athletic excellence this way. We think of artistic excellence and artistic abilities this way. What we do is we think of people, whether it's athletes or artists or moral agents or intellectual agents, we think of them as having certain capacities or competences, and we judge the value of their actions, the value of their successes according to how well those are connected up with the able or competent agency that they're manifesting in the specific domain. This also explains why and in what sense knowledge is opposed to luck. So there's a long tradition that knowledge can't just be luckily true belief. There's some sense in which the difference between knowledge and true opinion is that you can get true opinion just sort of by luck. You can have a lucky guess, or it could just be a coincidence that what you want to be true ends up being true. Knowledge can't be lucky in that way. So how are we to understand this relationship between knowledge and luck, or knowledge and lucky success? Well, on this view, it's just an instance of this more general idea that excellent agency or competent agency and success through competent agency is opposed to just mere lucky success. So we make a distinction between, say, winning the game through your own abilities and successful playing out the game versus, your opponent got sick, or if you're racing, your opponent fell down. And that's what, those would be lucky successes as opposed to success grounded in ability or grounded in your own athletic prowess or something like that. And the same view also explains why we value knowledge over mere true opinion. So, you'd rather win the game by exercising your own abilities or powers than by just winning by luck. We value success through agency more than we value mere lucky success. And on this view, knowledge just fits into that framework too. When we get something right through our own cognitive powers, that can be juxtaposed to getting something right just by luck, just like in general, when we get something right, when we achieve some success through the exercise of our own competent agency, that's to be juxtaposed to a mere lucky success that we really can't take credit for, that can't be attributable to us. Okay? So all that is just in favor of a certain epistemological framework. a general epistemological framework that I now want to use to think about perceptual knowledge in particular. Okay. So now part 2, perception and perceptual knowledge. So how should we think about perception and perceptual knowledge in terms of this general framework? And the obvious way is to think of perception as a kind of cognitive ability or power, and to think of perceptual knowledge as grounded in that distinctive kind of power. So perceptual powers are abilities to form various kinds of belief on the basis of various kinds of experience. So you have visual perception, auditory perception, olfactory perception. And the processing involved, the way that our brain takes us from experience to belief, is not inferential, it's not reasoning, it's its own kind of perceptual processing. And in fact, different modalities do it different ways. But what it doesn't involve is reasoning from premises to conclusion. So that is a pretty natural way to think about perception and to distinguish it from reasoning. But on the other hand, we have good reason for thinking that perception is conceptually and theoretically loaded. So perception is concept-laden in the sense that when we visually experience something, okay, no, I got it. When we visually experience something, for example, a tree or a house, we don't experience, and again, I'm opting for one sort of way of thinking about perception here. We don't experience mere shapes and colors and contrasts. What we do is we experience the object as a tree or as a house. So obviously we have to have the concept of a house or a tree if you're thinking of perception this way. But it's also theory-laden in the sense that perception is influenced by prior assumptions, background beliefs, expectations, special training, and the like. So for example, you're much more likely to perceive a hose as a snake if you've been told that there are lots of snakes in the area. So your belief that there's lots of snakes here, say in this yard, is going to maybe create a kind of disposition in you to see the hose as a snake. So your belief is affecting perception, right? So we've got a problem then on how to understand perception, because on the one hand, perception seems to be more direct than reasoning, seems to be something other than reasoning. But on the other hand, perception does seem to be conceptually and theoretically loaded. So how can both these things be true? Okay. So that's sort of the problem that we have, and which is going to be, I think, the key to understanding how perception in general takes place, and also how moral and religious perception might be possible. So one suggestion is that our concepts and background beliefs shape our perceptual disposition. So they act as a kind of, not as premises from which we draw conclusions like in a reasoning process, but they act as kind of causal antecedents that sort of shape the way we see things or shape the way we interpret our experience. But we want a model for how this works. We need a model for how perception can be thus theoretically loaded and yet not in a way that involves what nowadays are considered psychologically implausible beliefs and inferences behind perception. Okay. So nowadays, cognitive scientists talk about cognitive penetration. Okay. And cognitive penetration basically refers to the various ways in which higher order cognitive processing can affect how and what we perceive. And so I want to look at some evidence for the phenomenon of cognitive penetration, get a feel for it, how it works, and then look at a model for explaining it. Okay, now here, this is the part of the lecture that could go seriously wrong and off the rails because we're going to do a little experiment here, okay? And if the experiment doesn't work, I haven't really figured out how I'm going to handle that. The first thing we're going to see is how we can be primed to see what we might otherwise miss, okay? So I said that, like in the case where you're told that lots of snakes are around, well, you might perceive a hose as a snake and in that sense be involved in a kind of misperception, but you also might now be ready to see a snake where you would have missed it, right? I don't know if any of you have ever been walking through the woods where somebody who's really experienced at it says, look, there's a deer over there, you know, and at first you can't see the deer, but then after a while you kind of get the hang of it, but just the fact that you know what you're looking for acts to let you see things that you would have missed otherwise, okay? All right, so what I'm going to do is tell a little story, but the story is going to be read. I want this half of the room to close your eyes, okay? This half of the room, close your eyes, don't read the next slide. This half of the room, read the next slide. You got it? Okay, now everybody open their eyes. How many people see something in this picture? Raise your hands. So it's mostly this side of the room. How many people see a man on a horse? Look at this side of the room. Few people see it, but not everybody sees it. It's much more this side of the room, right? So the narrative, little narrative that primed you to see the man on the horse was a little story about a man on a horse, or just mentioning a man on a horse. Okay. So that was an example of priming you to see something you might otherwise miss. Here's an example of how you can be primed to interpret your experience one way rather than another. Okay? So this time I want this side of the room to close your eyes, and this side of the room is going to read the story. Okay? You got it? Now close your eyes. Other side of the room, open your eyes. I'm giving you two different narratives, okay? Okay, now everybody open their eyes. How many people see a mouse? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people see a man with glasses? Okay, that one didn't work as well. It worked, but it didn't work as well. The other one worked much better. But the idea is that this is an ambiguous figure, right? You can see it either way. If you got the story that kind of brought up men, teachers, etc., people, you're more likely to see it as a man with glasses. If you got the story about animals, you're more likely to see it as a mouse. Okay. So here's a theory about what's going on here. Okay. The main idea of schema theory is that our cognition involves what are called scripts or personae through which information such as sensory appearances is processed. And so here's the psychologist talking. To understand the social world, the layperson makes heavy use of a variety of knowledge structures, normally not expressed in propositional terms, and possibly not stored in a form even analogous to propositional statements. Okay. Rather, a script is a type of schema in which the related elements are social objects and events involving the individual as an actor and observer. So a script can be compared to a cartoon strip where certain things happen in captioned scenes. So for example, there's the restaurant script of you go into the restaurant, you order, you eat, then you pay, then you exit, and that's sort of the restaurant script. And what that does is it frames your expectations about what's going to happen when this script is activated in you, and you're more likely to perceive things in a certain way once that script is activated. So social judgments and expectations are often, anyway, mediated by a class of schemas which we call persona. So persona are cognitive structures representing personal characteristics and typical behaviors of particular stock characters. So another word for this is a stereotype. Okay. So some persona or stereotypes are unique products of one's own personal experience. So someone you knew, like your coach or your aunt. Others are shared within the culture or subculture. The sex pot, the earth mother, the girl next door. So once the principal features or behaviors of a given individual suggest a particular persona, subsequent expectations and responses to that individual are apt to be dictated in part by the characteristics of the persona. And we have various ones we can think of. So, for example, we have the hippie. Oops, I keep going. So we have the hippie. We have the bully. The hippie and the bully are kind of bad guys, but we also have good guys, right? So we have the kind doctor as opposed to the evil scientist. We have the good cop as opposed to the bad cop. We have the loving mother as opposed to the wicked stepmother. So these are various stock characters that we have that we can draw on. So as an application to perception, suppose you've got the restaurant script activated in you, and suppose this guy comes walking towards you, right? The idea is that you're much more likely to just perceive that guy as a waiter, okay? Now, he's dressed like a waiter, and he's carrying waiter stuff, but that doesn't make you a waiter. I mean, if you could see this, you could see the same thing in a crowd, or maybe a more ambiguous figure in a crowd, and you wouldn't say that's a waiter like you would if you saw that same guy coming at you while you're in the restaurant. So you're perceiving this guy as a waiter, partly based on perceptual cues, but those cues are being driven by the script you're working with, or maybe the persona that you're working with. Take the persona of the surly waiter. If something about the waiter has activated this persona in you, that you now are thinking of him as a surly waiter, you're more likely to interpret his tone of voice one way rather than another way, or to interpret a facial expression one way rather than another way. So again, what these different schema do is they make you sensitive to certain perceptual cues, and they get you to interpret your experience one way rather than another way. Okay. So I was going to do another experiment, but we'll skip that. But a zoo script. A zoo script was supposed to prime you to see that as an elephant. Okay. Okay. So for our purposes, the point is this: schema theory, and this is just one way of explaining cognitive penetration, or the way that higher order thinking can sort of seep down and affect perception. So this is just one way that it might be done. But if it's right, schema theory explains how perception can be conceptually and theoretically loaded, but not driven by reasoning. Schema help us to interpret experience as opposed to reason from experience. Okay. So now that's an example of how a cognitive resource or a cognitive structure can shape the way you see things or hear things or feel things even, not by providing premises that you can then reason from and make nice conclusions, but by having a different kind of effect on your cognitive processing so that you get you get a different perceptual take than you otherwise would have had. Okay, a few further points. One is that schema can undermine or enable excellent cognitive functioning. So schema aren't all good or all bad. One thing is that schema are what cognitive scientists refer to as heuristics. And what heuristics do is they make you a lot faster. They make your thinking a lot faster. They're kind of shortcuts to do a lot of fast work with only a little information. So schema is a nice example of a cognitive heuristic. So what they do is make perception much faster, but they can also make perception more or less reliable. So good schema will make you more reliable. Bad schema will make you less reliable. So for example, if you're equipped with racist schema, that's going to be bad for you, right? It's going to make you see certain people as dangerous when they're not really dangerous. Or you're going to interpret certain movements as aggressive when they're not really aggressive, right? On the other hand, if you've got good schema, they're going to make you more reliable. So if you think of this, I mean, you're certainly an expert in some domain or another. Maybe it's with a certain kind of athletics, for example. Maybe you're a soccer player. Maybe you're a basketball player. Through experience, you're able to see things unfolding before you in a way that a non-expert couldn't. So you might be able to recognize a defense, or you might be able to recognize a certain play developing because you've got those right categories in your mind to interpret your experience. So that's going to make you more reliable. Also, if you're, say, an expert bird watcher, you're going to be able to pick up on perceptual cues that will allow you to quickly identify a bird in a very reliable way that someone who has less cognitive resources here wouldn't have. Okay? Schema can also make perception more or less powerful. So reliability has to do with how often you get things right as opposed to wrong. Power has to do with like the range of judgments you can make. So the more and the better and the richer schemas you have, the greater the range of access to reality that you're going to have. But on the other hand, the worse or the less or the more sort of ham-fisted your schema are, the worse off you're going to be for making judgments in a different range. Okay? That's why you can navigate your own cultural setting much better than you can navigate a foreign cultural setting, because you're just not equipped with the conceptual resources to see and hear what you're equipped to see and hear when you're in a familiar setting and like the characters are familiar to you and the actions are familiar to you, etc. Okay? So the basic idea behind, so now I'm going to try to make the argument that this opens up the possibility of moral perception. The basic idea is that we are equipped with moral scripts and moral persona. Okay? So for example, we have our bully. We have the kind doctor and the good cop, etc. And we have the bad characters as well. Now, the idea is that if all perception involves schema-governed interpretation, then moral perception involving this kind of interpretation would be just another kind of perception. It's like no mysterious thing. So, for example, the moral perception that some man is dishonest would not be essentially different from the empirical perception that some man is a waiter. In both cases, you've got a kind of resource on which you pick up on the way the person looks in order to make a judgment. Sometimes it's just about a physical property. Sometimes it's about what the person's job is. Sometimes it's about what the person's character is like. Okay. So again, the main idea is that we now have moral scripts and moral persona. We've seen that according to schema theory, perceptual processing involves scripts and persona, or at least it can sometimes. And some feature of a situation activates a relevant schema, and as a result, we're disposed to see or hear things a particular way. And so the present suggestion is just that these might be moral ways as well as empirical ways. And so moral schema might influence one to see a movement as aggressive, to hear a voice as threatening, to feel a touch as reassuring. And depending on how good your resources are, it might do so in a way that makes your perception more reliable and more powerful than it otherwise would be. So again, certainly some schema amount to no more than stereotypes and myths. And in such cases, their influence would undermine the reliability of our moral judgments and thereby have a negative epistemic effect. So that's certainly possible. But it's also possible that more apt schema contribute positively to the reliability of moral judgments, helping us to see or hear or feel what actually is the case and to perceive what we otherwise might miss. So the conclusion at this point is that schema theory really does nicely explain how moral perception is possible or might be possible. It's just straightforward. It makes moral perception just more of the same stuff. It's just that it gives us the content of moral judgments as opposed to other kinds of judgments. Okay. Can we say the same thing about religious perception? So can we say the same thing about religious perception or the perception of God? And I think things are a little bit more difficult here since God doesn't typically appear to us through sensory experience. So, the dishonest man or the kind doctor, you're getting sensory appearance, right? It's just like physical object perception. We don't think of religious perception as working that way, but we can broaden the notion of experience to go beyond just the five senses and to include something like feeling God's presence or feeling God's love or hearing God's voice. So in the typical case, we won't interpret feeling or hearing here literally as sensory feeling or hearing, but it's not much of a stretch to say that, well, this is just another kind of experience alongside these other kinds of experience. And we could add other kinds of experience as well. So again, proprioception is a kind of experience that gives you a sense of where your body, the position of your body. So like if you have your eyes closed and you're just sort of floating and not touching anything, you would still be able to say, you would know that your right hand is raised and your left foot is up and things like that. Doesn't go into the five senses. That's another thing. So there's no principled reason why we can't expand the kinds of experience that we acknowledge. And there are many cases, of course, where people claim to have something that they would describe as an experience of God or religious experience. So in this story here, it comes from William James' Variety of Religious Experience. Towards the end, the person says, the darkness held a presence that was all the more felt because it was not seen. Then, if ever, I believe, I stood face to face with God as born anew his spirit. So he wants to use sensory language, but I don't think he means that he actually, physically felt God. But there was some experience that he interpreted as feeling God's presence. And you get, there's just a whole variety of ways in which this might happen. So you get what I think of sort of just ordinary lay experience of God that somebody might have just through prayer or through a special event. Maybe they see a newborn baby, or maybe they just narrowly avoided death. And in all these cases, you might have some kind of sense of God's presence or activity or involvement. But then we also think that there are ways in which you could cultivate this ordinary experience to heighten it. And this is what some spiritual training might do to make you more of an expert in this sort of just ordinary sense of God in creation. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's sort of extraordinary mystical experiences that seem to be something of a whole different order, but that people seem to want to describe by analogy to sensory experience in various ways. So now, let's just take one of the ordinary cases. Okay, so let's take an ordinary case of religious experience. Let's say you go to see a newborn baby. Maybe it's your friend's baby. Maybe it's your sister's baby. Maybe it's your baby. But you see you feel God's presence. That you get an experience that God is with this child, or this child is a gift from God, or something like that. Now, suppose that in that case, again, just suppose, God really is appearing to the person. So there is this experience, and it really is something that God is causing the person to have. That the person takes her experience that way, and that the person's belief is grounded in an ability to recognize her experience of God for what it is. So if all those things are true, I think on the present account, we should count that as perception. This would count as a perception of God, because all the various elements of perception would be in place. You'd have the actual object of perception. You'd have the actual object of perception appearing to the person in a certain way, and you'd have the person with cognitive resources to take that as an appearance of the object appearing that way. So you've got everything in place that you would have in physical object perception and also in moral perception. Okay, so I have just a few minutes left, and I'm going to use that to look at some traditional objections to the possibility of moral and religious experience. And to tell the truth, I only need a few minutes here, because once you've got this conceptual framework in place, once you're thinking of perception as the interpretation of experience through schema and other cognitive resources that allow a kind of interpretation of experience, the traditional objections to moral and religious perception are kind of easy to answer. So one traditional objection is that if the theory, So one objection is that moral and religious experience are influenced by education, culture, etc. So one traditional objection to moral experience, for example, is that, how you morally see the world is influenced by how you were brought up, what you believe, what your assumptions are. But that's just a version of a more general idea that moral and religious experience is theoretically loaded. But on the present view, all perception is theoretically loaded. So that can't count against the possibility of moral perception or religious perception that is theoretically loaded in this sense, that it's influenced by education, culture, etc. So basically what schema theory shows is that cultural influence is not incompatible with cognitive excellence. On the contrary, cultural influence, other kinds of training up of your sensory or perceptual capacities can actually enable and improve excellent cognition, as opposed to always being undermining of it. Another objection is that moral and religious judgments attribute high-level or complex properties. So, for example, to judge that someone is honest or kind or selfish is to attribute a range of dispositional properties that cannot manifest themselves in a moment's experience. Likewise, if we judge that God is a loving creator. So the idea here is that to judge that someone is a kind person or an honest person is not to just make a judgment about that person at the moment. It's to make a judgment about that person's character. It's a judgment about what kind of person person is, what type of person that is. And that, the objection goes, can't just be revealed in a moment's experience. And so moral properties are typically like that. Similar with the sort of religious experience, you know, where we attribute something to God. It's just not the kind of property that can be experienced in the moment. Okay? But again, on the current account of perception, it's perfectly possible to perceive high-level dispositional properties. For example, anybody here, you know, being enculturated as we have been enculturated, can see that a vehicle is a fire truck. That's a highly complex dispositional property. But just by the perceptual cue of the profile and color, et cetera, of a fire truck, you know it's the kind of thing that's used to put out fires, that it can go a certain speed, that it makes certain noises. I mean, you can perceive that it's a fire. Being a fire truck isn't something that's just sort of exhausted by the moment's experience. It's a highly complex dispositional property, but you can easily see that something's a fire truck. So again, the idea that there can't be moral or religious perception because moral or religious judgments involve high-level dispositional properties, it just doesn't work as an objection to the possibility of this kind of perception. Okay? Then I have some other non-visual examples. So if you have the right training, you can hear that the brakes need replacing, or you can smell that the carburetor needs tuning, right? These are high, complex dispositional properties, okay? But with the right perceptual training, you can be cued in to what is presented in your experience in a way that will reveal these more complex properties, okay? Okay, final objection. There's widespread disagreement in moral and religious matters. And so if moral perception were a reality, for example, there would not be so much moral disagreement. Ditto for religious perception. If a person can just see that an action is right or wrong, why doesn't everybody see it the same way? Or if some people can feel God's presence in their lives, why can't everyone feel God's presence? So again, this is another objection for thinking of what's going on here as a kind of perception. Okay? So I think that what this objection is assuming, at least implicitly, is that perceptual abilities must be innate, or at least widely shared. So that if you have a perceptual ability, I have it too, we all have it. Okay? And, you know, except in exceptional cases like somebody's blind or something like that, right? But on the present account of perception, that's not right. Even empirical perception can be the result of highly specialized training and other particularities of one's circumstances. So we have no more a natural ability to see that someone is a waiter or that a car is a Volvo than we have to see that someone is dangerous or dishonest or kind. So in other words, perceptual powers need not be widely shared or equally effective. Schema theory in empirical psychology explains why and even predicts that that would be the case. Because we're given different schema to work with, we're not going to have the same perceptual abilities. Think of a tourist in a city versus a seasoned city dweller, right? There's stories in New York City where somebody, you know, goes up to a tourist and asks them what time it is, and they clutch their purse, you know, because the only schema that they're working with is from like the movies where it's all crime and disaster and all hell breaking loose, right? They don't have a schema where somebody just comes and asks you what time it is. Here's an example of expert perception. Well, even the city perception is kind of expert perception. You become an expert by living in the city and sort of getting familiar with the cast of characters, so you can better discriminate who's dangerous and who's not, right? We could multiply examples. I won't go on. You get the idea. So another theme in virtue theory, the kind of framework that I'm using in epistemology, is that nearly every human excellence, including cognitive excellence, is the product of both nature and nurture. So we're born with certain capacities by virtue of our common human nature, but these capacities are trained up in specific ways according to specific circumstances. And just as our natural capacities can be nurtured and developed, they can be neglected or distorted as well, and our perceptual capacities are no exception here. So again, think of the perceptions of racists or religious bigots. You know, you can have the way you see the world distorted through bad training, or you can have the way that you see the world enhanced by good training. So as social animals, we're largely dependent on our communities, not only for our physical health, but also for our intellectual or cognitive health as well. So as a final thought, our abilities to see right from wrong, or to see others as valuable, or to experience God in our lives will largely depend. This is going back to the idea that, you know, since there's so much disagreement and variation, it couldn't be perception, right? But if the kind of view I'm presenting here is right, then the way we see the world will largely depend on the communities in which those abilities grow up. Not only on the things we are explicitly taught, but on the stories we're told, the images that were shown, etc. So with these stories and images, we are quite literally teaching our children how to see the world. So, the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Greco, for this most illuminating presentation that I'm sure has inspired already a lot of questions and comments and thoughts in our heads. So we've got 2 microphones, and we would ask you to speak into the microphones if you would like to raise a question. So at this point, just raise your hands, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you'd respond to what R.C. Zaehner thought. He thought there were different kinds of religious experience in a famous book. There's a kind of experience of God, theistic, mystical. There's a kind of experience of unity with Brahmana, sort of monistic. There's a kind of experience of being one with everything.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you might think that they're the same experience, but they're a different schema brought to them, or would you say that no, maybe they're really different sorts of religious experience?
Right. That's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to it, but I think it's a great question to think about and explore further. So what I used to think was that a plausible explanation, from at least a certain point of view, a plausible explanation would be that it is the same experience, but that different religious traditions give us different conceptual frameworks to interpret it. And so different religious traditions are going to experience as, you say, you know, Brahman or the One or God, you know, the God the Father. So that would be one way of thinking about it. But recent work on cognitive penetration shows that our sort of background beliefs and assumptions can affect not just the way we interpret the experience, but the actual phenomenal quality of the experience. So for example, this seems crazy, but it's like, if you read the literature, it's true. They've shown this now, all right? The way you identify an object can make you experience the color differently. So here's how it's a kind of a neat experiment to show. Here's one way that they showed it. They gave people dials, color dials, and they gave a picture of an apple, which is going to be categorized as red, just so we think of apples as red, and then a sort of arbitrary object where you don't associate a particular color with it, like a car, something like that, or maybe a banana, which you think is, yeah, right? And so, and then you use your color dial to adjust the colors to be the same. So you're looking at the colors, and the dial lets you change the color of the thing until you get it on your view, the two things have the same color. And what it showed is that the people put the apples and the bananas on different parts of the dial. So in other words, they had to get further away from red in the one case than they did in the other case. So they were, but in their perception, they were seeing the same thing, okay, the same color. Another example was you'd given them the object, and there's only one object now, and they say, turn the dial until the object is white. Okay, so I guess if I think I've got this right. One end of the spectrum is blue and the other is yellow. And so to get the banana to appear white, they had to go further into the blue spectrum and away from the yellow than they would for a non-yellow object. So what that shows is it's not just affecting the way your sort of prior assumptions and categories are not just affecting what concepts you're applying, it's also literally affecting how it looks. Okay? So maybe in religious experience, the Buddhist and the Christian mystic, say, might have, by bringing different backgrounds, they might actually have a different quality of experience. But this is all in the who knows category, you know?
Found in different
Yeah.
religions. So among
Yeah.
Hindus, there are some that had theistic,
Uh-huh.
and others didn't.
Thank you for the talk. So I guess my question has to do with how we should think about what next. In this sense, so if we think about the trained up ability of bird watchers to get chickadee right and house sparrow right, and to get, it's doing a mating, that's its mating call or whatever, right? We have that expertise is validated in a certain way by the way it interacts with a wide body of knowledge that whose epistemic credentials are not exhausted by instances of perceiving as. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about all the sort of animal science that's going on, animal behavior science that's going on, and the way species concepts get sort of articulated genetically, and with populations and all the sorts of things, right? Mm-hmm. And so, from one point of view, like, it's going to be important and interesting to an animal behaviorist to make sure that they're cultivating their cognitive abilities in such a way as to make them more reliable scientists in the field. And we have stories to tell about how they do that and why they do that. I'm just wondering how we should think about, if we're going to see religious experience and moral experience as paradigmatically seeing as, it seems like we might want to develop stories about how that training and the concepts that get brought to that, which training and which concepts are excellent. And that's going to just take us right back to, it seems to me anyways, very little epistemological work has been done, because all the work's going to have to be done that's parallel to the work that has given us reason to embrace a wide-ranging set of theoretical assumptions evolutionary biology and animal behavior. So I'm just saying, so the point is like, this might be interesting this might be useful from the point of view of sort of, from what point of view is this helpful or important? With that stuff in the background. You see what I'm getting at? Like, I'm not sure why telling this story is giving me deeper insight into religious and moral aspects of human lives in such a way that's going to help me understand this epistemic status of various moral judgments or the excellence or lack of excellence of people who snap to beliefs about seeing God in all things, including the, things that we might say, no, that's not God. That's actually you just making bad decision after bad decision and barely scraping by, right? Like, right? So that's a kind of a long question, but you get the idea of the kinds of concerns I think that I'm interested in.
Yeah, sure. So, so you're right that the takeaway from this is going to be limited in certain ways. So, I'm trying to get back to the standard view of perception. So on the standard view, perception gives us cognitive access to a restricted and relatively narrow range of reality, and that access is immediate or direct. But a kind of third element of the standard view that I could have put in there is that it gives us our most reliable and sound access to reality. It's like something that we can, that's going to give us more assurance than any other kind of cognitive access. And I think that once you reject the standard view in favor of a more psychologically realistic view, some of the anchoring quality of perception goes away because it's tied up with the rest of our non-perceptual cognition in a way that now can't provide the same kind of foundation, so to speak, for the rest of it, because it's too tied up with the rest of it. So that's true. So what is the takeaway? Well, one takeaway is to reject a certain line of reasoning that is supposed to show that religious belief has to be irrational or unreasonable. And the line of reasoning goes something like this. There's the difference between the religious and the non-religious is precisely that you've got this sort of foundational anchoring in perception that you don't have in the religious. You can't perceive the religious in the way that you can perceive the physical world. So that line of argument is just not available anymore. So it's a kind of a same boat argument which says, look, be careful what you say about religious belief unless you want to say we don't know that there are trees and tables and chairs and things like that, right? So that's one kind of payoff. Another payoff is to sort of point to the importance of the perceptual training up. So if perception can just be sort of guaranteed to work on how it should as long as you're healthy and you don't have like a stick in your eye or plugs in your ear or something like that, then it might not seem important how we're training people in terms of what images, are they internalizing, or what stories, or what scripts, what persona they're internalizing, because it doesn't really matter. All of that stuff is epistemically irrelevant. Well, it turns out it's not epistemically irrelevant. It turns out if the only movies available to you have young black teenagers as criminals and drug dealers, et cetera, you're more likely to see young black teenagers as criminals. And this theory just explains exactly why. There are experiments where they put They had white subjects and black subjects, and in some of the pictures they put a gun in the white subject's hand, and others they put a power tool in the white subject's hand. Same with the black subject. People were overwhelmingly likely to see the gun in the black subject's hand, okay? So getting a better grip on how perception works, I think, clues you into the importance of certain kinds of informal education that we're not even really aware of. And so if we become aware of them, we can sort of get a better idea of how we can, train ourselves better. So that's another payoff. Third, I think, and I think this is one of my motivations, is to give people a kind of confidence in their experience. We live, here's a typical story. You grow up in a nice Catholic neighborhood, and everybody sees the Virgin Mary all over the place, but okay, that's but people feel God's presence. They see God in other people. They see God in nature, et cetera, and then they go to school, to a secular university, and you're told that that's just a load of crap, and that's just superstition, et cetera, okay? Well, not so clear. Who's got the right scripts? Who's got the right persona here? It's not just obvious, right? So I think that if you have, this can give you confidence in yourself by having confidence in your tradition. How when you start to look at it this way, when you start to look at the cultural resources that actually end up to be cognitive resources that your tradition has and that you lose when you go to this other tradition, again, that might just change your perspective on just what you're gaining and what you're losing, when you move from one community to another community. So I think there's various good things to take away from this, even if it doesn't sort of give you a guarantee that this person sees God rightly and this person sees God wrongly.
John, as a follow-up, follow-up question, and this has to do with what we're subjecting our students to in this enterprise called university education. So we're telling them that we are meant to make critical thinkers out of them. We love the word critical. We just put it in every sentence where we feel unsure what else to say. We also train their minds. I mean, there's no question that we train their minds. It seems to me that what you're proposing has tremendous implications for also understanding how, in fact, some form of training of perception can happen. So are we also making them better perceivers? And it would seem that some forms of education would bring that out and other forms of education would not, as you've suggested with your example.
Right. So from the point of view of schema theory, or which would include both persona, which are sort of characters, stock characters, and scripts, which are sort of stock situations, if you like, or some are more useful to have in your conceptual toolbox and to have internalized than others. And one way you might understand a liberal arts tradition, a liberal arts education, at least part of what a liberal arts education is doing, is it's passing on very rich and useful ways to think about people and to think about different actions. So basically we get stories, and the stories have characters, and they have sort of plot lines, and you get this in the Bible, you get it in great poetry, you get it in great literature, and somebody who is internalizing that that knowledge is in effect being equipped with much richer resources for interpreting their world, much richer resources than if all you see is, say, sitcoms or reality TV or action movies. And it's not that I have anything against action movies or sitcoms, but if that's how you see the world, as only through like well, I don't even know what the names of the shows are now, right? But in my day, it was all in the family, and we say, oh, that guy's an Archie Bunker, or that guy's a meathead. So yeah, those can be useful, but they're not quite as rich and deep as some of the other schema that you might get from a more, a richer approach. But there's also a flip side of that. I mean, this is why people don't want to just stick with the canon, and they want to say diversify and bring in other writers and other authors. Because I mean, one way you can interpret it is that we don't, as rich as this set of categories that we're transmitting is, there are other categories out there too, and our world is changing. Our world is more diverse, and there are resources that we could even do better to mine the resources of not just our own sort of narrow Western tradition, but other traditions, and also the experience of women, and et cetera.
So I have a question about, it's about when you get perception wrong, but it seems like maybe it's a difference between sort of this moral perception that you're talking about and physical perception. Because it seems like if I'm wearing Google Glasses around, so it's recording everything that I'm seeing, and I'm walking through the yard that I think is full of snakes, and I see a hose, and I think it's a snake, and then I go back and I look at the video, I can see, oh, no, I was just wrong, that was a hose.
Right.
And I can see the difference there. But then if I'm walking down the street and someone with a big scar across their face, and I think they're threatening, or I feel that they're a bad person or something like that, and then I go back and watch the video, I won't see anything different that will then, whereas it would take something like me talking to them, getting to know them, having said, no, he's a really nice guy, he just had a car accident, or something like that, where I wouldn't get it in my video. Whereas, so in the just physical, I could correct myself by getting no new information where I need new information to correct it the other way.
Yeah. Yeah, good. I mean, I think everything you said is right, but I'm not sure what to take away from it. So, there are various ways that we can check our perceptions. Sometimes there are, anyway. And you were giving us an example of how you could. There are also various ways that we can check our higher order kind of thinking, but again, only sometimes. So, I mean, you can go through life with your racist theories, or your theories about evolution, or whatever, and you can either by accident or by design just make sure you're impervious to any counter evidence, right? So it's not just perception that can be sort of either checked or not checked. It's really sort of any aspect of our cognition that can either be checked or remain unchecked. And it's a matter of, sometimes how much effort we want to put into it as individuals. More often, it's sort of the social checks around us, right? And that's another reason why we want to cultivate diversity, because if everybody's thinking the same way, we're not going to provide checks against each other in the same way as we would if people are coming from different perspectives. So yeah, I think what you're saying is right, but it's a matter of degree, not principle. And often we're not wearing Google Glasses,
And we have time for one more question.
I have the microphone, so I'll ask it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the schemas themselves, and about both their epistemic status, and then also the way in which they're developed. Because what we've heard is that we get these schemas in our minds, and then we apply them to maybe some kind of raw data of sense experience, and then derive meaning from them. But presumably those schemas themselves need to be developed at some point in time.
Right.
And I'm wondering if the flow, so to speak, goes the other way, right? So if these schemas develop because of some sort of accumulation of sense experience from which we distill kind of key narratives or stories that we then tell ourselves. So that would be on the development. And then concerning the epistemic status, I mean, we've heard a lot of different functions that schemas serve. Mm-hmm. Some of them attune us to reality in better ways. Some of them mislead us from reality in other ways. So how can we understand the way in which, or the extent to which, schemas put us in touch with the real?
Right. So, 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 so schema are supposed to be these, sometimes they're described as cognitive structures, but not sets of propositions. They're more like stories or characters or something like that, templates for a character or template for a set of action or something like that. And you can get them from anywhere. So you can get them from real life people. So your experience of your real life football coach might shape how you just perceive football coaches, right? Or you could get it from a documentary, or you could get it from just the completely fictional characters, right? So you could get them from all over the places, all over the place. And then presumably, even in the case where you're getting it from a fictional work, that fictional work didn't just come from nowhere, right? And maybe the reason that fictional work has staying power is because it's describing something that we all recognize from our own experience, but then it crystallizes something, and makes it more salient to us than it already was. So we recognize it, but then once we recognize it, it becomes even more internalized and ingrained, and now we sort of use it as a more powerful lens. So, so that covers the development question in terms of like, where do these things come from, and is there like a kind of a two-way street from experience to schema? And then the other question was
concerning their epistemic status, to what extent do they put us in touch with reality? It seems
Right.
there's a wide range of things that schemas do.
Yeah. So I don't know if I have more to say here than just sort of the obvious that I don't think schemas in and of themselves, by their nature, enhance cognition or undermine cognition. It kind of depends on whether it's provides a good interpretive lens or not, whether it serves a good way to divide up your reality or not. So I'm sure that the schema of, let's say, the persona of the homeless person that we get from just sort of superficial media is one thing, compared to, say, the rich set of probably several persona of homeless people that someone would have by working with the homeless. So, the sort of what you get from the media is just like sort of one guy. They all look the same, and they all, they're drug addicts or whatever. It's just a very sort of a stereotype, a caricature. But what's the problem with that caricature is that it doesn't allow very fine discriminations, and it doesn't allow fine discriminations for the reality we actually face. Whereas somebody who's actually working with homeless people and sort of says, well, there's this kind of homeless person, there's this kind of homeless person, and even there you're sort of categorizing the person, not treating them just as a person, but nevertheless your categories at least are a lot richer and a lot more fine-grained, and now are going to allow you to make discriminations that the person with the more ham-fisted schema just can't make, right? So it's just a matter of how well they support reliable and fine-grained judgments, and it's going to be largely a matter of how well they fit the reality that you're using them to represent or interpret. I mean, take that person who has the rich set of persona for homeless people, and now transport them to, and let's say they're working in the city, so it's all city people, right? Now transport them to a rural area where none of those people are. Now those schema are useless. They won't even be activated because there's nothing there to activate them for. So there's nothing intrinsic to the schema that makes it a good or bad. It's more of how well does it fit your reality and help you to sort of make the kind of judgments that you need to make. Yeah.
Well, I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that we've become better perceivers today. Professor Greco, thank you very much again for your wonderful lecture.